Okie dokie. Okay, I'm glad we're here on Holy Week. We don't meet on Holy Week. We don't usually meet the week after Holy Week. And as I was telling Dee, I have even thoroughly confused myself. So I'm going to try to unconfuse because I've given people different answers as to when we're ending. So I say this so that way I will hear myself say it and you'll do it and you'll hold me accountable. And I'm dead serious. And to give you the roundabout story, then I'll give you the right dates. Yeah, normally we'd take these 2 weeks off, go into the first week of May. Then we sold the building, and then we were going to have moving, and then we had a revival. So then I moved it back to this week again, but then the revival got moved. So long story short, we are meeting all 4 Mondays, and then moving the next day. So we're meeting all 4 Mondays in April. Okay? All 4 Mondays in April. As I say that, I am going to tell you about a revival that the Williamson Road Ministerial Association will be conducting, and that will be May the 1st through the 3rd. So I'm just telling you that way you can hear it and put it in your calendar. It'll be over at Huff Lane Park. The first night speaker is Kendrick Golston, who played professional football, and he also, I think he's the head of Young Life in Roanoke Valley. He's doing the Monday night message. Tuesday night will be Hope Marquez, he's a Hispanic pastor, and third is Kevin McNeil from Bethany. So there'll be 3 different pastors each night, and I know it's called Music, Message, and Snacks. So it'll be 6:30 to roughly 8 o'clock. Bring a chair. If it rains, we'll move over to Northminster. There. So I just wanted y'all to know. That's why my phone doesn't work. But also just to confirm when we're having Bible study. So we will have it the next 4 Mondays unless something really fluky happens. So counting tonight, just through April. How's that? Okay. And after April, we will end, which is about normally what we would do. We will get through Palm Sunday next week. So the funny part of it is, as I look at it, where we're getting into John is almost to Easter, where he's in, we'll get up to like when he's up in the upper room. So we'll be celebrating it here. We may not finish it in John, but we'll at least be celebrating. Does that make sense? And then we'll join back in Acts in September. So our prayer concerns for this evening, the Sarver family, because they've had 2 sick children, 1 in the hospital, and we know that Jessica lost her mother, plus the father just moved in. So they've got a lot on their plate. We've got Chris and Karen that are both just having recovery. So prayers for them. But as I say that, Karen said, give us praise because her friend Julie, and Lynn Brooks all had positive outcomes from test and or procedures. So the praise. And the other concern we have from our church family is Glenn and Peggy Lyle. So prayers for them. I know Ray from the community who's been in and out of the hospital watches us regularly. So I'm just going to ask for prayer concerns for him. And so like I was telling Mary Alice last week when you wrote down, I said he had hit a low point, and knowing that y'all are praying, your prayers are important because even when we can't pray, like he said, it brought him comfort knowing that others were praying for him, and he wanted me to share that with y'all publicly. So with that said, let's pray. Gracious God, we just thank you for the opportunity to come together in Christian fellowship to share our joys as well as our concerns. Many of us got to spend time in fellowship over a meal, and now we're coming together to spend time in study. And God, you've given us this precious gift, your word, the Bible. And so often many of us take that for granted. Many of us who claim your name as Christians don't want to dig a little bit deeper to get to know you and get to know what your son modeled and taught while he was with us. But we've taken that time so that we can be blessed. And so we ask for a blessing in this space so that when we leave this place, yes, God, we will be blessings for others. You've heard the concerns of our heart. You've heard the concerns on our lips. You hear the brokenness and the concerns of our world, from, again, natural disasters to acts of violence and war. God, we just bring it all up to you. And we just ask that where we, as Christians around our world, we model love. We offer it through our lips and our lives so that the world can get a glimpse of something different than what it is offering to others. So that instead of hate and violence, they will be moved to show love and peace. God, we ask those that are in the place of war for protection. We ask for those that are in the midst of natural disasters for peace, and those that are in the midst of recovery, strength. And God, we do pray all this through your son, Jesus, who promised us that we could have all things if we pray it through his name. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're praying, as the Apostle Paul said, all things through his name. We're praying it tonight. Amen. So we are in John chapter 11. We got to verses 1 through 16. We actually got up to verse 10. I'm going to, for those that missed us last week, or to catch us up, bear with me. I'm going to read 1 through 16 real quick. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. Do y'all feel like I just touched on Lazarus yesterday? Yeah, I did. It's like I'm going back and forth, back and forth. I'm so confused. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and the sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet, which we touched on yesterday in the sermon, which we will not get to till Bible study till probably the end of next week, with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and his sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And I told y'all last week, a pastor friend of mine struggled with this. She said, if he loved him, why did he not come? And I said, well, think about this. We can't just pick and text and call or email. This is first century. Most likely it took a day to get to Jesus. So guess what? By the time Jesus got the message, Lazarus dead. Jesus knew this. The messenger guy probably didn't know this, but Jesus did, because we know that by the time he gets there, he stayed 2 days, took a day for the person to get there. They traveled back. He'd been dead 4 days. So do the math. He's dead. Then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. If he then walks by that night, he stumbles, for he has no light. In other words, Jesus using this image of daylight, and I believe he's referring to himself as the image of light. And this is where we got into last week. And he said, basically, as long as they did the work of Jesus, walk in doing what was right, following God's will, they would not stumble. It's only when they did not focus on Jesus' light and purpose, they would stumble. When they walked in the ways of the world, when they had doubt, it's when they would stumble. This is where we got to. So let me go ahead and quickly read 11 through 16. I'll come back to 11. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. I think about this. Imagine your disciples hearing this right now, because Jesus knows the underlying story, and they don't. But let's go to him. Then Thomas, called Didymus, i.e. the twin, said to the rest of the disciples, let us go also so that we may die with him. Verse 11, Jesus said what? Lazarus was sleeping, and which is true. The disciples said, sleeping is good news. I mean, what do what do the doctors tell you to do when you're sick? Plenty of fluids and rest, sleeping, even in first century, best medicine. So they thought this is good. He's getting rest. We know that Jesus means more than just sleeping. And the reason and truth is, as far as Jesus was concerned, he's going to wake the guy up. He was sleeping. In fact, we talked before, we've done example when we did Matthew, we did Jairus' daughter. And Jesus goes to the house of Jairus, and everybody's wailing. And he says, why are you wailing? He says, she's just asleep. And they laugh at him like he's crazy. And Jesus makes him leave the room, and Jesus raises, Jairus' daughter. Stephen does the same thing in the book of Acts. Sleep is often used as a euphemism for death. So, but they don't get it. They don't get the death thing. They think sleep, and they're hoping that he'll get wetter. I should have had caffeine. Slow it down. Jesus had been speaking in verse 12 of death, and John acknowledges that. Since the disciples don't get it, Jesus now speaks clearly, so they do get it. Lazarus is dead. And Jesus says what? It's going to show he has power over death, which is so true. Like I said when we did this 2 Sundays ago in worship, so you guys have been all over the place in Bible study and worship. This power over death, it's center of who we are. Resurrection of the dead is crucial belief of who we are in Christian faith. But they don't get it. They really don't get it. But still, he lifts up one thing that they do get. The one thing, they may not understand the death thing, but they understand this next part in verse 15. He says, not the part that, for your sake, I'm glad I was not there, that you may believe. He's talking about this whole glorification of God, which they don't get. What they do understand is this last part here. Let us go to him. And they know that means they're going back towards Jerusalem, and they knew that going back towards Jerusalem meant death. And that's why, we got Thomas, who's often referred to as the doubter. Think about this. Here we see Thomas is acting in obedience. Now, let's go with him, though, that we may die with him. It's like a negative. I have the Eeyore voice going on. But I think that others would say, he means let's go die with Lazarus, or let's go die with Jesus. Either way, he knows that there's a good chance they're going to be facing death. Now we're at the part where I wanted to get to, 17 through 37. Let's read it. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to see Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Pause at this. At a service of death and resurrection, what the outside world calls a funeral, I'm hoping that you hear these words. If you're in a United Methodist service, this is part of the liturgy. We always lift up this one section here. Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, i.e. the Messiah, the Son of God who has come into the world. After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and he's asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Can you read me, Karen, verse 33? from your translation.
When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved.
Disturbed in spirit. Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that one. Appreciate that. Okay, so we got Jesus. We begin with Jesus' arrival in Bethany. Bethany, where Lazarus had died, as I said, 4 days earlier. Again, I told you at church 2 weeks ago, 4 days is important. Why? Because even up to the 3rd century, many Jews believed that the soul would hover over the grave with the hope of uniting with the body. You know, for 3 days it would hover over the body, hoping to reunite. But then as soon as that body would begin to decompose, it would leave. So it's now 4 days beyond hope that soul is going to reunite. 4 days to remind us and the crowd of the magnitude of this miracle. So again, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany, John gives us where the location is. Bethany, which was close to Jerusalem. So you would have had mourners there, friends, but you could have also had professional mourners there as well. Bethany, about 2 miles, our translation has, from Jerusalem. Also, Jerusalem, major city. Why so many mourners? Verse 20 through 24. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said, your brother will rise. And Martha said, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Martha. When's the other time you've seen Martha? Anybody else remember another time you saw Martha? What was she doing? Cooking, cleaning. Martha, that older sister. So she's that active, take charge person. So it would have been natural for her to take charge, to go to Jesus. So it doesn't surprise me that she's there. She's the first to go meet Jesus. And my guess, when she says, had you been here in verse 21, I don't think that's much as a complaint. It's just a plea. Lord, if you've been here, my brother would not have died. I know Jesus, in other words, you're a healer. You healed other people that were sick. If you just touched my brother, he would not have died. So I don't think it's a complaint. I've heard preachers that read it as a complaint. I really think she's being genuine. If you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. In fact, we hear when we get to verse 32, I don't know if you're paying attention when I was reading. It's like a deja vu moment. First thing Mary says when she sees Jesus, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But no, I want you to notice that her faith doesn't waver. She knows, she still believes in God, because she says, I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Now, maybe here she did think that for a brief moment that Jesus would bring her. It's like that fine line between faith and doubt. Maybe she did briefly believe that Jesus would raise her brother. I question that. Some will say that she did, but then I get over to verse 39 and I question that, because verse 39 says what? Lord, don't move the stone away by now. My brother stinks. He's dead. Bad odor. So I question that one. Anyway, let's go back to where we are. Jesus said to her, what? Your brother will rise again. It's open-ended. It's a general affirmation. He didn't say, your brother's going to rise in the next 30 minutes. He didn't say that, and so she could have been thinking, the future resurrection of the dead, that last day, which even the Jews believed in. In fact, as we see, Jesus' statement saying will rise again, it really didn't console Martha, because she is thinking that image of last day. I know he'll rise again in the resurrection. I know he'll rise and live eternally with God. But she was thinking it would be that last day. But Jesus did not mean some future distant resurrection. He meant Lazarus is going to rise again that very day. That very day, which we hear saying in 25, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, even though they die, will live. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? I am the resurrection and the life. I am life. Now, for me, when I hear this, I hear all the other stuff we've been through with John. And I hear Jesus with the woman at the well. I am, I'm living water. I give you life. Or that whole crowd that didn't understand it. I am the bread of life. You have all these conversations. That crowd longing for bread. The woman at the well. I am. It's got that whole relationship thing going on with God. He said, I am the source of life. Now, I think I touched on it that Sunday, and I don't remember. I think if we want a glimpse ahead, we got to remember this. Jesus did not promise prevention of a physical death, right? Because Lazarus, guess what happens to Lazarus somewhere down the road again? Lazarus is going to die. But I got to tell you, I could have done a whole sermon different on that. I was thinking, Lazarus had to not fear death. I mean, think about it. He had that whole near-death experience. No, he had the whole death experience. So he'd been there. He's probably thinking, why did they bring me back? So he knew. I mean, if anybody believed in the resurrection, Lazarus. And we're going to see that later because, the Jews knew the same thing, that the powerful testimony that Lazarus would have. But so Jesus did not promise prevention of physical death. He promised abundant life, which included resurrection and eternity with him. Christ, even though he would raise him, it would be temporarily. It would not prevent Lazarus' physical death. Even Lazarus, even though he's going to be raised from the dead, he would eventually die again. I don't know if we think this thing through, but there is no Lazarus walking around. But I truly believe Lazarus was a believer, and I wouldn't say that Lazarus was guaranteed eternal life, through faith. That gift. It's only through Christ. He says, I am the source. I am the resurrection life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though he dies, he or she. Whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? And she says, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. Yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God who has come into the world. She offers a statement of faith. I believe that you are. And when I was working on this, just to get ready for you again, I think that's the same question that's offered to each of us. Do we really believe it? Do we really believe it? Now, I know people sometimes think I'm flippant about death, but I have no death wish. I'm like the Apostle Paul. I want to serve as long as I can. I do. But I don't fear death. I mean, we were kidding today about my green folder on the desk, and they said, what happens when it moves? I said, I'll wait till the last day before I pack it up so you don't have to look for it. But I think it's because we're promised so much more. But God also wants us to make the most in this life as well. So do you believe this? So we end on this high note. She believes it, and then we go back in. After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside, saying, the teacher is here and asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, so he's still in the outskirts of Bethany, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. So that's why I said this. I'm not sure if these are just friends here. I think there are a bunch of professional mourners here as well. So I see this image. So picture this. She calls her sister Mary from the crowd of mourners. She takes him from the crowd of mourners. She wanted to speak to Mary secretly. And maybe it's because she knew the whole thing if brought attention to Jesus. So she pulls so the Jews would not follow Mary and Martha out. It's just going to be a sister thing. But as soon as Mary leaves, what happens? The crowd follows, which means whatever happens next, it's going to be a public appearance. So the crowd goes, and with it, Mary says basically the same identical words that Martha said. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Both Mary and Martha, they were convinced Jesus would have been able to do something that would have kept their brother Lazarus living. He could have healed him. He would have made it so that he would be alive. But I truly, even though we heard Martha's statement of faith, like I said, when we get to verse 39, I don't think really either of them thought the idea of bringing Lazarus back from the dead, I don't think that was really something they really could conceive. I think they had enough faith to believe that Jesus could have healed him. But even with Martha's statement, I'm not sure if that's the case. So we can see this. I think Jesus sees the doubt in Mary and Martha's eyes. I think he sees the doubt, the skepticism, the wrong motives of the mourners. That's why when I get to 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews had come along weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he asked, where have you laid him? Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. And the Jews said, see how he loved him. Some translations say moved. Yours said disturbed. I like the translation agitated. It's like Jesus agitated. Maybe this excessive sorrow. I don't know. And I'm not trying to be funny. You ever been to a funeral and you got some of the people there that are grieving more than the spouse or the family? It's like they're trying to draw attention to themselves. They've been great professional mourners in first century. So there's this excessive sorrow going on. Maybe that's what agitates him. Maybe he's disturbed because he can see the sisters' limited amount of faith. He's like they're so close and they're just not there. Or maybe there's the whole unbelief of, like I said, they believe Jesus could heal, but I don't think they really grasped that Jesus could raise the dead. So that's why you see this word, this word that's often translated as sorrow can also be translated as, get this, anger or indignation. Most authors want to translate it as sorrow, but the anger, indignation, early translators, they struggled with the idea of Jesus being agitated or this idea of indignation. They wanted to soften it. Even when I preached on this, I'm leaving camera space. Even when I preached on the past, I see this idea, that Jesus is moved and there is compassion, and even Warren touched on it yesterday. But my brain is thinking ahead to Bible study yesterday, and I'm thinking Jesus is pissed. Jesus is mad. He's not all that happy at the moment. And I love it and the reason I say that, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, reformer, 15th century, when he translates this, what does he say? Jesus is angry. Jesus is angry. So picture it this way. He's angry. He's angry about the unbelief of the crowd, the sisters, angry perhaps because sin and death in the world. Do you ever get upset because of death in the world? Do you ever get upset when you see war in Ukraine, you read about war crimes? Do you get upset when you see about these random shootings that take place in schools? Do you get upset and angry when you see 30-some thousand plus that in what was that, the earthquakes? Do you get upset when they're just random acts of violence over and over and over? Yeah, I do. Yeah. This is Jesus. I think it's like he's got all his thoughts going on. But most of it, you've also got the Jews in the crowd. They're just along for the ride. They're just along for the show, the unbelief. But remember what Jesus told them before they went back to Jerusalem. Remember, before he left, And he said, this is for God's glory. And to go back, when he got the news, he said, all this is going to be for God's glories. Jesus told us, and we're back here, back to the passage. So Jesus says to the sisters, and he says to the crowd, where have you laid him? Where have you buried him? And they invite him to come and see. And so Jesus goes. And what do we see in verse 35? Jesus wept. Why? Well, this you could have a whole bunch of layers on Jesus wept. Why? I mean, yes, Jesus did love Lazarus. So we do have that emotional connection. I think Jesus, it's like, you ever just confused and you don't know what you're crying about? I do with Disney shows all the time. But Jesus wept. I mean, he had a love for Lazarus and the sisters. I mean, if your best friend is hurting, you're sad with him. You're sad with him. So Jesus had his love for Lazarus and the family. I think Jesus wept because there was sadness and death. I mean, when we have friends that lose someone, there's part of us that just cries with them. I think there was that faithless grief that was around him that he wept, and he wept. But I do think it's important. I think the one thing that we can take with this, sometimes we cry when we're angry. Sometimes we cry when we're confused. Sometimes we cry when we're sad, right? I mean, this is fully human Jesus here. Jesus wept. For whatever reason, Jesus wept. And I think that's one thing we can take comfort with, is he's just like us. Sometimes we cry when we're angry. Sometimes we cry when we're confused. Sometimes we cry when we've lost control. Sometimes when we cry when we're mad. Jesus wept. Jesus is relating to human sufferings. I see some of you looking already to Isaiah 53:3, and basically when Isaiah talks about the prophet or the one that was going to come, the Messiah, he says it would be a man of sorrows, a man of sorrows, a man familiar with suffering. A man familiar with suffering. The Messiah would be a man familiar with suffering. Jesus walked the same walk that we walk. He went through the same temptations that we go through. Now, the crowd doesn't get it. The crowd doesn't see that Jesus got all this head stuff going on right now. They don't see they just see that Jesus is sorrowful. They say what? See how he loved him. See how he loved him. But some said this. Same thing that Mary and Martha said. Couldn't this guy that opened the eyes of the blind man kept this guy from dying? Had he been here earlier. So then we get to the raising part. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time it's a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days. And for Ray, I know you're the King James person. I know it says he stinketh. And then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here. They may believe that you sent me. And then he said this, in a loud voice, Jesus called out, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. So picture this. The question that the crowd asked, I know mine does yours go to a different section, or does yours keep on going does yours go from verse 37 right into 38, or do you have like a big subheading over yours? Yeah, mine's got subheading too. So let's pretend there's no subheading, no verses here. Let's just pretend the story. And the story is it's a continuation. The disciples said, the crowd said, could not this man who cured the blind, kept this guy from dying? And again, Jesus is doing what? He's here to bring God glory. If Jesus had been there, Lazarus would not have died. So we can see there's this conditional belief that the crowd has going on. They believe Jesus could have worked a miracle. The crowd believes, even the sisters, Jesus could have worked a miracle, but Lazarus would have had to have been alive. So now Lazarus is dead. They don't believe it's going to happen. They don't. They couldn't or didn't comprehend that Jesus could do a miracle even now, even after Lazarus had died. Again, 4 days, and Jesus said right up front to his disciples, purposely, this will bring God glory. So verse 38, 39, I'm going to let you, Karen, read your verse 38. Don't hate me.
Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed,
Disturbed, I like
came
that.
to the tomb.
Yeah, disturbed. See, mine has deeply moved. You can say Jesus with anger and indignation. It's that same response he had earlier. You know, he's taken to the tomb. There's this cave with a stone laid across the entrance. I've shared before. We'll be talking about it this week, Easter. Tombs at this time are often, caves cut in the limestone, rock in the hillside, large enough for people to walk inside. Several bodies could have been placed in the tomb. So Lazarus has been in this tomb. He's been placed into such a tomb. And so Jesus and the crowd, they come to this tomb. Jesus asks for the stone to be removed. And Martha says there's odor because the body has begun to decay. The body is now decomposing. I've never had a dead body that I've been around. Human was decomposed. I've only had animals. I don't know if any of you have been around a human body that's decomposed, but I know animals, when they decompose, really bad. So I can't imagine a fully grown adult. It would probably knock the wind out of you. And that's what Martha's acknowledging, that there's odor. But Jesus ignores this. And he says, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Now, they have no idea what he's talking about, but he's saying this to the disciples. He just told them 4 days earlier. So in verse 41, we see them removing the stone. And you can imagine the crowd watching. Oh, you got probably people saying, what's this guy doing? So or if we're watching a movie, you've got the music starting to rise, you got the suspense building right now. Suspense. And then Jesus stops in the middle of the suspense and he takes time out and he prays. And he stops and he prays. And he praises God. It's a prayer of thanksgiving. He does it loud. I can envision Jesus loud, so you get everybody, no matter where they're standing, they're hearing it. It's publicly. And he says this, why? So that they're witnessing this resurrection, that they would believe in Jesus, and they would know that the source of the miracle came from God. Again, he says, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this because he said, God, we could have had this conversation off on the hillside, it's you and me do our thing. But here, I got all these people. I want them to believe. I did this for the benefit of those people standing here. See, that's why I said you can see the tone. The tone that they may believe that you sent me. So they may witness that to know that the source of the miracle came from God. It's a prayer addressed to God. It's a prayer of thanksgiving, a prayer that shows the relationship with Jesus to God. It's a prayer that's also to influence the listeners. I mean, Jesus, like I said, he didn't need to do it out loud. Jesus is always constant in his relationship with God. I and the Father are one. But he did it so the crowd would both see and learn. And then he cries out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And I did touch on this on that Sunday, 2 weeks ago, because I just thought it was the funniest thing when Augustine, that church father of the way passed, and he said, Jesus had to call Lazarus by name, because if he didn't, all the dead people would have come out of the graves. And I was thinking, I know that was Augustine being serious, but me, it's like I hear a sense of humor. But there's truth. There's power. Jesus who has power over the dead. So Lazarus, he does come out. Lazarus, the once dead man, now restored, not decayed, comes out. And in verse 44, it says, what? The dead man came out, his hands, feet, wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around his face. You got a fully restored man in burial clothes, okay? Completely in burial clothes. There's no question that the dead man had come back to life. But you got to imagine the crowd. Even if Jesus said this, do you think they were really expecting Lazarus to come out of there? No, they don't. I can hear people laughing in the background. But now, dead guy comes out. And probably some of them just freaked out and ran now that I think of that. But what do you think happens? I don't see him running to him. I see it's like this shock and awe thing going on right now. And I think that's why Jesus says this to him. Take off the grave clothes and let him go. You got bound up Lazarus here. Lazarus wants to get out of this stuff. He wants to start living life again. And so he has to they're excited, they're in awe, and they're in shock at the same time. Okay, so something powerful has just taken place. Let's keep going. 45 through 57. Your sheet says 54, but we're going through 57. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them that Jesus, what he had done. The chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is the man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come, take away both our place and our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. He did not say this on his own, but as a high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for the nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the Jews. Instead, he withdrew to a village near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus. As they stood in the temple area, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all?" But the chief priest and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, they should report it to them so that he could be arrested. So, just like today, Jesus divides people into two camps, believers and unbelievers. Many who came to see this miracle, Lazarus raised from the dead, they came to believe. But for others, I don't know if they doubted or thought it was like, they just seen David Copperfield and they figured it was a trick. So they go tell the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, like we've said before, they're looking for a reason, any reason to destroy Jesus. See, they saw what he was doing as Jesus, but others saw what Jesus was doing, like the Pharisees, as dangerous. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. And they said, "What are we accomplishing? Here is a man performing many miraculous signs." Again, many signs, like what? Like raising the dead. And what are we accomplishing? We're getting things like jealousy and fear. What are we accomplishing? They really don't want to answer some of this rhetorical question. But they know they got a dilemma. And they've got to find a source for the dilemma. Because they said, if we let him go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him. Then the Romans will come take away our place and our nation. The dilemma is Jesus' growing popularity. The Sanhedrin, they got political concerns going on. They have their own self-interest. They say the Romans are going to come, take our place. Some would say that, it's the temple, and that's how most would translate it. Personally, I don't think it's the temple they're concerned about. I think it's their position of authority they're concerned about. And then they say they're going to take our nation. So they're afraid that they're going to lose their religious and their political system, especially if others see Jesus as the Messiah. So it's not just taking away their place of worship, but their authority, that Rome might step in or Rome might bring additional hardship upon the people. And I love what Life Application, I didn't put this on this, but Life Application said there was this fear, just the fear of change. Jesus was different. fear of change, holding on to their positions, power, and authority. You know, Jesus, who was looking at the law different than it had ever been looked at the past. So all this change was taking place. And Life Application said that in itself was causing anxiety for the leaders. So in verse 49 and 50, John says, then one of them named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up. And he says, you know nothing at all. You do not realize it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. John says Caiaphas was leading the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin at the time. The Sadducees, the elite and educated, wealthy, they were tied to Rome. But here we see him also. He is the head of the Sanhedrin. It was also the high priest. Now, John says what? It was also, he was the high priest that year. We want you to be clear. Caiaphas was not just high priest for a year. Caiaphas was high priest from 18 to 36 AD. 18 to 36 AD, he held that position. Now, I say that because I put on your sheet, and we're not going there, but in Romans, if you remember, we touched on before, when you became a high priest, you were a high priest for life. But now Rome's in charge. And what Rome gave, Rome could take away. So if you threaten their authority, Caiaphas was afraid of losing his position of high priest. Rome could take it away whenever they wanted to. And so he was convinced in verse 50 that nothing short of Jesus' death would save Israel from being destroyed by Rome. He says, do you not realize it's better for you that one man, i.e. Jesus, die than for us as a whole nation to perish? Now, the truth is, saying that Jesus would spare the nation of Israel from a physical destruction, that didn't happen. Because we talked about before, what happens in 70 AD? Rome destroys the temple, Rome destroys Jerusalem. So, plus they also didn't realize Jesus came to save them from spiritual destruction. So you have Caiaphas, the high priest, and people look for the high priest, and he's offering up a prophecy here. You got this prophetic voice coming from Caiaphas. He says, he prophesied that Jesus would die. He's going to be like a martyr for the nation, and he's going to bring people, all these Jews that are scattered around, he's going to be uniting. He's giving a bunch of rhetoric here that these people are buying into. He's going to bring the people together and make them one. So they're thinking, we can use Jesus. This whole theory of common enemy, will bring people together. I mean, think about it in history. The one just came to my mind now, and this was not mine. The Nazi, they had a common enemy, the Jews. Here, the Jews had a common enemy, Jesus. And they thought, well, if we can get the world to say that, we took out Jesus to spare the nation, we will unite a nation. Now, Caiaphas was wrong in his motive, but Jesus would die, in essence, to unite people. All, we just said communion, all can come to Jesus in faith, right? Gentile, non-Jew, and Jesus. But this idea of bringing people scattered abroad because of Jesus' death, that wasn't going to happen. So from that day on, verse 53, it says they plotted to take his life. Those that were gathered that day at the Sanhedrin, they were plotted. They had the rallying call. It is now time to move to action. They plot to kill Jesus. And because of this, again, they think they're in control. Aware of the plot, like we read in verse 54, Jesus withdrew north. He's in Bethany area. He's withdrew north to Ephraim, and he's going to stay there till we come back for the Passover next week. And that'll be in the next section. The Passover we're talking about, and I know I'm right at time, the Passover here, in verse 54, it's almost time for the Jewish Passover. We got this whole idea they're getting ready for the Passover. They're looking for Jesus. But remember, there's strict orders that anyone sees Jesus has to report it. The Passover, 30 AD. Why do we say 30 AD? When did Jesus die? Most likely around 30 AD. So this is the backdrop. This is the backdrop for what we just celebrated on Sunday, Palm Sunday. This is setting the stage for what takes place next. Because we're going to have, before the Passover, we're going to have the whole anointing thing when we come back, and then we'll have the entry. So we'll do both of those. You'll be thoroughly confused. You'll celebrate Easter next week, and then you'll go back and do Palm Sunday the day after. So, on that note, we shall pray. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Y'all have a good week. Y'all have a good week. Those online, we have services at 7 on Thursday, 7 Friday, 7 a.m. Sunday, or that's on the outside porch, 8:30 digital, set up for communion, and 10:30 in person. See you then.